This is a story about a little stick figure named Sketch. And the afternoon, he looked down at his own hand and could not stop staring at it. It was an ordinary afternoon. He was sitting by a window, half watching the sunlight fall across the floor, when he lifted his hand into that beam of light and turned it slowly back and forth. And, for the first time in his entire life, he asked a question he had somehow never asked before. Where did this color come from? Not the question of who his parents were, or his grandparents. A deeper question than that. Why is my skin exactly the shade it is, and not some other shade? Who decided this? When was it decided? And the more he stared at his own hand, the stranger it felt, because he realized he had no idea. Sketch did not know it yet, but he had just pulled a thread that would unravel one of the longest, strangest, most dramatic stories in the entire history of life on Earth. Because that color, whatever shade it happened to be, did not come from nowhere. It did not arrive by accident. It was not some random roll of the dice. It was the ending of a survival story that took hundreds of thousands of years to tell. It was a slow-motion negotiation between his ancestors and one enormous, blazing, 93 million mile distant ball of fire that had been, frankly, absolutely refusing to play fair the entire time. And just as he thought that, the sunlight in the window seemed to grow brighter, warmer, then almost too warm. Sketch squinted. The room around him began to dissolve, the walls melting into open air, the floor turning to dry, cracked earth, and the gentle afternoon sun swelling into a giant, glaring, unblinking eye in the sky that stared straight down at him with what he could only describe as total indifference. Sketch had no idea where he was, but the sun knew exactly what it was doing. And it had no regrets at all. When Sketch's eyes adjusted, he found himself standing in the middle of a vast open grassland, somewhere in ancient Africa, roughly 300,000 years ago. The grass shimmered in the heat. The horizon stretched out forever, and all around him, going about their day, were the very first members of his species, the very first humans who had ever lived, and every single one of them had dark skin. Not most of them, not the majority, all of them. Sketch turned in a slow circle, looking from face to face, and there was not one pale person anywhere. There were no fair-skinned people. The idea of light skin did not even exist yet. He thought about every history book he had ever seen, every painting, every story, and he realized with a small jolt that every single human being who had ever lived traced back to this exact place and these exact people who looked the way they looked for a reason he was about to learn the hard way. Because at that moment, the sun pressed down on him like a heavy hand, and Sketch suddenly understood that his skin was not just a wrapper. He had always sort of assumed skin was packaging, the bag his body came in, the thing that held his organs together while he walked around. But standing under that merciless sun, he felt his skin doing something, working, straining. And he realized his skin was an organ, his largest organ, quietly doing dozens of jobs at once. And right now, it was fighting for his life. The thing it was fighting was invisible. The sun was firing something at him, something he could not see but could absolutely feel, a kind of energy that came down in silent, relentless waves. This was ultraviolet radiation, and it was not his friend. It slipped into his skin and started breaking things. It snapped chemical bonds. It damaged the delicate instructions coiled deep inside his cells. And if enough of that damage piled up in the wrong place over enough time, it could twist a cell into something dangerous, something that grew when it should not, one of the most aggressive cancers there is. Sketch flinched and looked around, panicking, and that was when he noticed the difference. The ancient humans beside him were not flinching. They stood in the same brutal sun, calm and unbothered, because their dark skin was doing exactly what his could not. Their skin was packed with a pigment called melanin, and melanin, he now understood, was not just a color, it was sunscreen, a built-in, always-on, living shield. The more melanin a person carried, the darker their skin appeared, and the more of that invisible radiation it caught and blocked before it could reach the precious instructions hidden in their cells. Dark skin, Sketch realized, was never just a look. It was armor, and here, under the most intense sun on the entire planet, it was the difference between living long enough to have a family and not. A voice seemed to drift down from the giant eye in the sky, flat and uninterested, and it explained to Sketch how all of this actually worked. There was no designer up here. it said. No artist with a plan for what humans should look like. There was only a slow, cold, patient process running the same calculation over and over billions of times across every living thing. Does this trait help you survive long enough to have children? If yes, keep it. If no, erase it. That was the whole rule. It did not care about beauty. It did not have opinions. It just ran the numbers. And here, under the African sun, dark skin was a yes. A hard, loud, unmistakable yes. Every single generation. Sketch nodded slowly, thinking he finally understood the whole story. But the sun was not finished with him. Because the radiation did not only attack his skin, it reached deeper into his blood. And there, it hunted something small and invisible and absolutely vital. Something that, if destroyed at the wrong moment in the wrong person, could end a new life before it had truly begun. The thing it hunted was a molecule called folate, a form of vitamin B that floated through the bloodstream doing quiet, essential maintenance. Sketch almost shrugged at the word vitamin, the way most people do, but then the sky showed him why it mattered. It showed him a pregnant woman among the ancient humans in the very earliest weeks of carrying a child, often before she even knew. And it explained that folate was what allowed the tiny structure that becomes the brain and the spine to close and form correctly. Without enough folate, in those first fragile weeks, that structure could fail. The result was heartbreaking. Severe defects, lost pregnancies, children who never had a chance. And ultraviolet light, the sky said coldly, destroys folate. It reaches the blood and tears the molecule apart. And in this sun-drenched world, with no clothing, no shelter, no shade to hide in, that destruction was constant. Sketch felt the whole picture click into place, and it was bigger and more serious than he had imagined. There were not one, but two completely separate reasons that dark skin was favored here. The first was that melanin protected the instructions inside every cell from damage, lowering the risk of cancer. The second was that melanin protected folate in mothers, protecting the children who had not yet been born. Two different threats, one single, elegant solution. Under this sun, dark skin was not merely useful. It was, for the survival of the entire species, very nearly mandatory. If evolution kept a list of its best work, Sketch thought, dark skin would be at the very top, tested and proven across hundreds of thousands of years, which only made the next part more confusing. Because somehow, somewhere, this perfect thing was going to change. Sketch stayed in that grassland a while longer, and the longer he watched, the more he felt the weight of what the sun was doing to these people. Day after day, year after year, life after life. It was not a single dramatic event. It was the quietest, slowest thing in the world. A child born with a little more pigment grew up a little safer. A child born with a little less carried a little more risk in their cells, in their blood, every single hour they spent under that sky. None of them knew it was happening. None of them felt the dial turning. They simply lived and loved and raised their children, and the sun kept its endless, silent count. He watched a mother walk past him, her arms wrapped around a small child, and he found his throat tightening. He understood now that her dark skin was protecting the folate in her body, and that meant it was protecting the very child she might carry next, the brain and the spine of a life not yet begun. Her skin was not vanity. It was love, written into biology, generations before she was born. And every mother before her, all the way back, had carried that same quiet protection, or had not survived to carry anyone at all. That was the part that struck Sketch hardest. This was not a story about appearance. It was a story about who got to live. Under this particular sun, with this particular intensity, dark skin kept folate safe and kept the cells safe, and so dark skin kept families whole. The ones without it, in this place, simply left fewer children behind. Not through any cruelty of their own, just through the cold arithmetic of a star that did not care. And so, over an unimaginable stretch of time, the entire species here became dark-skinned, completely and uniformly, not because anyone chose it, not because anyone preferred it, but because, under this sun, it was the only setting that worked. Sketch looked at his own pale hand again, here in this place, and for the first time he felt how out of place it was. Here, his hand was not neutral. Here, it was a liability. Here, the very thing he had never thought twice about would have been slowly, quietly working against him. He pressed it to his chest and kept walking with the ancient people, humbled, beginning to feel just how much of himself had been shaped by a sky he had never even thanked. The ground shifted under Sketch's feet. The grassland began to slide past him, slow at first, then faster, and he understood that he was moving. Not just across land, but across time. He was walking out of Africa, the way small groups of humans had begun to do somewhere between 70 and 100,000 years ago. No one had called a meeting. No one had announced a great journey. It was just drift. A family wandered a little farther than their parents. Their children wandered a little farther still. And over thousands of years, that small, restless habit carried humans into the Middle East, across Asia, up into Europe, and eventually into lands no human foot had ever touched. And as Sketch traveled north, something began to change. The sun was getting weaker. Not the sun itself. The sun was exactly as enormous and indifferent as ever. But up here, far from the equator, its light arrived at a low, slanting angle, sliding through far more atmosphere before it reached the ground. The radiation that had hammered him in Africa was now thin and gentle. The days grew short. The winters stretched long and dark. The sky stayed gray and overcast for months at a time. Sketch wrapped his arms around himself and shivered, and he realized that everything had been flipped upside down. In Africa, the problem was too much radiation that he needed to block. Here, the problem was too little radiation that he desperately needed to absorb. And just like that, the dark skin that had been perfect in Africa became a problem. It was not about cancer anymore, the sky explained, much quieter now. Up here, the gentle sun barely threatened the cells at all. It was not about folate either. With so little radiation, there was almost nothing to destroy. No, the problem was something new, something that almost never gets the credit it deserves. It was vitamin D. Sketch learned that his skin was meant to be a kind of solar panel. When the right kind of sunlight struck it, his skin used that light like fuel to manufacture vitamin D right there inside the body. And vitamin D was not optional, not even slightly. It was the thing that allowed him to absorb calcium from his food, and calcium was what made bones hard. Without enough vitamin D, no amount of good eating could save the skeleton. In children, the lack of it softened and bent the growing bones, bowing the legs, flattening the skull, stunting the whole body. In grown women, it could soften the bones of the hips, and softened hips made childbirth terribly dangerous, sometimes impossible, and it did not stop at the skeleton. It weakened defenses against sickness, sapped the strength of muscles, and dragged at the body in a dozen quiet ways at once. Now Sketch finally saw the cruel logic of it. A dark-skinned person standing here in the weak northern light had skin that was brilliant at blocking radiation. But that same skin was now blocking the very light it needed to make vitamin D. The skin could not tell the difference. It could not separate the dangerous light it should stop from the useful light it had to let in. It simply blocked. And so, in a world with no supplements and no medicine, the bodies began to fail, the children grew up with bent bones, and the mothers were lost. So the cold patient process did what it always did. It reversed. The very same algorithm that had selected so fiercely for dark skin in Africa now began, just as fiercely, to select against it here. Tiny chance changes that dialed melanin down a little appeared in the population, the way changes always do. And instead of being erased, they spread. Because a person with slightly lighter skin made slightly more vitamin D, grew slightly stronger bones, and was slightly more likely to live and have healthy children. Generation after generation, a little lighter, a little lighter, a little lighter. The dial was simply turning the other way. To show him what it truly meant, the sky pulled Sketch down into one of those long northern winters, into a small settlement huddled under a low gray sky. There was no blazing sun here to fear. The light was thin and pale and tired, barely making it through the clouds, and for weeks at a time, it did not really come at all. Sketch wrapped his arms tighter around himself and walked among the people, and slowly he began to see the quiet damage that the missing light had left behind. He saw a child trying to walk, and the child's legs had bowed outward, curved where they should have been straight, the soft young bones unable to harden without the vitamin the weak sun could not supply. He saw older people moving carefully, achingly, as if their bodies had grown fragile from the inside. And the sky told him, gently now, that there were mothers in places like this who did not survive bringing their children into the world because the bones that should have been strong had quietly softened in the long, sunless dark. None of them knew why. They only knew that something here was hard on the body in a way the old, warm homeland had never been. Sketch stood in the cold and felt the cruelty of the trap. These were the descendants of those same magnificent dark-skinned survivors he had admired in the African sun. Their skin was still brilliant at its old job, still blocking radiation beautifully. But here, that gift had become a quiet curse, shutting out the faint light their bones were starving for. The skin could not learn. It could not adapt within a single life. It simply did what it had always done, in a place where doing it was slowly killing the people it was meant to protect. And that was when the reversal stopped being an abstract idea to Sketch and became something he could feel in his chest. He understood now, standing in that freezing settlement, exactly why the dial began to turn the other way. It was not fashion. It was not preference. It was children who could walk without pain. It was mothers who lived through childbirth. It was, once again, simply who got to survive and pass life onward, in a world that had quietly changed the question it was asking. The same merciless arithmetic, run in reverse, in a colder, dimmer place. Sketch assumed this slow lightening had happened gradually, over hundreds of thousands of years, a smooth, gentle slide as people moved north. But the sky stopped him, and what it showed him next genuinely surprised him. For a very long time after they first arrived, the early hunters of Europe were still quite dark-skinned. Even after living in the cold, gray north for tens of thousands of years, they had not turned pale at all. The sky showed him one of them, a real person, a man who lived in what is now Britain about 10,000 years ago. Scientists today even have a name for him. And when they read the ancient instructions still preserved in his bones, they found something that looks almost impossible to modern eyes. He very likely had dark to medium dark skin, dark curly hair, and bright blue eyes. Sketch stared at the man. At that combination he had always been taught did not go together, and felt the ground of his assumptions shift again. The very pale skin that so many northern people have today, the kind that burns in about 12 minutes of summer sun, did not spread widely until something like 6 to 8,000 years ago. Sketch did the math in his head and could hardly believe it. In the full 300,000-year story of humans, that was the last sliver, the final scrap of time, almost yesterday. So, what happened back then, he wondered, that suddenly threw the whole process into fast forward? And the answer turned out to be one of the biggest changes in all of human history, a change almost no one ever connects to the color of skin. It was farming. The moment humans stopped wandering to hunt and gather and settled down to grow their food, the sky showed him the new world of the early farmers, and it showed him what they ate. The old hunters had eaten a wild and varied diet, full of oily fish, organ meats, shellfish, the very foods richest in vitamin D. They had been quietly getting vitamin D from their meals as well as from their skin. But the farmers ate mostly grain, wheat, barley, oats. Their vitamin D from food did not just drop, it collapsed. And suddenly, people who had been getting by were left depending almost entirely on whatever their skin could squeeze out of that weak northern sun. And if their skin was still fairly dark, it simply was not enough. So the pressure to lighten, which had been a gentle nudge for ages, became suddenly desperate and intense. And there was a second thing, the sky said, that made it all move faster still. The farmers lived together in large, crowded, settled villages. In the old days, a helpful change in a tiny scattered band of 50 people might take ages to reach the next group. But in a dense village of hundreds, all connected to other villages, a helpful change could race through thousands of descendants in just a handful of generations. The collapse of vitamin D in the diet and the sheer crowded density of farming life together slammed down on the fast-forward button. And within just a few thousand years, the quiet drift of skin tone became a rapid, visible rush. By now, Sketch thought he had the shape of the whole story. But the sky had one more thing to teach him, and it was the part that changed how he saw everything. He had always pictured skin color as a simple switch, a dark gene and a light gene, one winning out over the other. But that, the sky told him, is not how it works at all. The color of skin is not controlled by a single switch. It is the result of dozens of different genes working together, like a whole orchestra. Some control how much pigment is made, some control which kind. Some control how the pigment is arranged inside the cells, and how the skin answers the sun over time. It is not one note, it is a chord made of many. And then came the truly remarkable part. When different groups of humans, living far apart on different continents, independently evolved lighter skin, they did not all do it the same way. The people of East Asia and the people of Europe both ended up with much lighter skin than their equatorial ancestors. But the genetic changes behind it were largely different. They reached almost the same destination by walking completely different roads. Sketch found that almost dizzying. The same answer, lighter skin in a low-sun world, was discovered more than once, separately, by people who never met. Scientists have a name for that, the sky said. Convergent evolution. And it is one of the strongest signals biology can give. When the same solution gets invented over and over from scratch, it means the problem it solves really, truly mattered. The pressure of that weak northern sun was so consistent, so unrelenting, that nature found the same way out again and again. And while we are here, the sky added, look closer at those blue eyes. Sketch looked, and the sky told him something that made him hold his breath. Every single person alive today with blue eyes, everyone, with no exceptions, is descended from a single individual. One person, one tiny change. One moment, somewhere near the Black Sea, around 6 to 10,000 years ago. Before that one person was born, every human on Earth had brown eyes. Brown, brown, nothing but brown, as far back as you could go. Then this one change appeared, dialing down the pigment in the eye, and it spread. Sketch sat with that. Something he had always thought of as ancient and deep, something humans had used to sort each other for ages, was actually younger than farming, younger than the great old stone circles, younger than the day humans first tamed the horse. The version of humanity everyone thinks of as fixed and eternal, he realized, was still freshly written, the ink barely dry. The grasslands and the gray winters and the crowded villages all began to fade, and Sketch felt himself rising up, away from the deep past, with the whole long story spread out beneath him like a map. And from up there, finally, he understood what skin color truly is. It is a dial, a calibration, a setting. At its core, beneath everything humans have ever piled on top of it, the color of skin is simply the body's best ancient guess at how much sun protection a person needs, based on the latitude their distant ancestors happen to live in, the food they happen to eat, and the particular sun they happen to live under. That is all. It is a record of an answer to a single question. How much of this star can you safely take in? And from up here, the things people fight about looked so small and so strange. Light skin was not better in any real sense. Down near the equator, it was actually dangerous, letting in too much radiation, risking the cells, destroying the folate. And dark skin was not less evolved, not primitive, not a starting point left behind. It was the original, the default, the baseline that everything else was simply a variation of. If anything, Sketch saw lighter skin was the newer thing, the recent adjustment, the late edit to a much older draft. And then came the deepest twist of all, the one that made him almost laugh and almost ache at the same time. The very same sun that pushed some people toward more pigment to survive its power also pushed other people toward less pigment because they needed more of its fading light. The same star, the same indifference. The sun never picked a side. The sun had no favorites and no opinions. It just poured its light down on a moving, spreading, wandering species and let that slow, cold, patient process sort out the rest. Humans had built whole towers of cruelty and ranking and prejudice on top of what was, underneath it all, a vitamin D problem. A question about calcium. A trick for protecting folate. Nothing more. And then Sketch was back, sitting by his window. The afternoon light fell soft across the floor exactly as it had before, as if no time had passed at all. He lifted his hand into the beam once more and turned it slowly, looking at his skin. But it did not look the same to him now. He was not seeing just a color anymore. He was seeing a message, a record, written in melanin, of every place his ancestors had walked, every sun they had stood under, every long winter, and every blazing noon they had survived to bring him here. His hand held a story hundreds of thousands of years long. He thought about everyone he had ever passed on the street, every shade of skin he had ever seen, and he understood now that each one was the same kind of message. Every tone, dark and light, and everything between, was an answer to the very same question, asked by the very same star, by the very same restless human family that once stood together in the African sun and slowly, bravely, spread across an unpredictable world. We are all still changing, even now, he thought, too slowly to ever see in a single life, but changing all the same. He looked at his hand one last time, and for the first time, he did not wonder where the color came from with confusion. He knew. And he felt, of all things, a quiet kind of awe, because he was carrying a piece of the oldest story there is. And so, he realized with a small smile, was everyone else. Every shade of every person who had ever lived was an answer to a question asked by a star, and Sketch finally felt lucky to be one of the answers.